says a substantial number of the community will contract the virus. He's been receiving the same briefings as the government.
Yeah, that's the point. This is a situation where a bipartisan approach works in terms of the Chief Medical Officer. He advises the government and the opposition. This language from the opposition spokesman, a lot more alarming than that coming from the Health Minister or the Prime Minister. I guess they're trying to shut things down at the border. He's predicting a substantial proportion of the population will actually get this thing. Of those, 15% will have it really bad and 5% like intensive care, critical. That's pretty alarming stuff. When you start hearing that, you start, realising why people are stockpiling. We're told not to. It's hard for me to get my head around this, Kieran, when we only have 40 or 50 cases here. We've had two deaths, two very sad deaths, but they're very elderly people. How do we get from this situation to the situation Chris Bowen's describing? But that's what he must be hearing about as a scenario from the health officials.
Yeah, he said the modelling suggests a substantial number will contract it. We'll have more on that a bit later. First, let's look at the issue of the emissions reduction plans of both sides of politics. Today, the Prime Minister was reflecting on the 2050 target of Labor, but in the context of his own government's technology roadmap. Have a look.
That's what a target without a plan means. It means a tax on Australians because they have no plan to make it happen otherwise, Mr Speaker. We're putting together the technology plan and the technology roadmap, Mr Speaker, which may well exceed a zero net carbon outcome in 2050, Mr Speaker.
Scott Morrison in Parliament, and the Prime Minister says their approach might exceed that of Labor. Very interesting remarks today.
A lot of people around the Parliament are talking about this today and are somewhat puzzled by it, especially from the Labor side. They're saying, is this a shift from the Prime Minister? I've been told from the Liberal side not to read too much into it, that he's sort of saying if the technology really came on board, of course that might happen, but we're not setting the irresponsible target that Labor is. So they're keen to play it down. Labor are keen, obviously, to seize on it and say, why is he even criticising our policy? He's talking about the situation where there might be an even greater emissions reduction by the government. Just in relation to coronavirus, I just had some information then, Kieran. That is that this business of the travel bans, like on South Korea today, I'm being told it really is a day-by-day assessment now, and there is therefore the prospect of potential travel bans on Italy and Japan. And they're looking at the case numbers and how it evolves every single day. So even though those travel bans didn't occur today on Italy, and they talked about stronger border control measures, I think it's quite possible in the next couple of days we'll see even further travel bans, I guess, to avoid that sort of situation that Chris Bowen talks about.
And to slow it down as much as possible. Let's, but on that matter we're talking about in terms of the government's technology roadmap, it's interesting, and I'll put this question to you again, because when the Prime Minister's saying that their approach might exceed the net zero emissions, it might be better. They might be able to have greater offsets and greater abatement by 2050. If that's the case, doesn't that diminish their political attack on Labor over their target? Even though they can, criticise Labor for a lack of detail on how they get there, if he's saying they could better that target, how do they say, that's irresponsible, it's going to kill the economy and that sort of thing?
Depends if he keeps saying it. I think it might be a bit of a one-off, but let's see. I think he sees too much political advantage in saying Labor's not about jobs, it hasn't got a plan to get there, we've got the plan to get there. He's keen to emphasise that. So that's when he comes out with this extra line. Interestingly, Energy Minister Angus Taylor was supposed to release that technology roadmap this week, but such have been the developments on coronavirus, the government's clearly pushed that back a bit. They want some clear air for that. And they want to be able to say, we're protecting coal and jobs, and we're about emissions reduction. But until we know more, we're not prepared to set the sort of target Anthony Albanese is, and pointing out again that he hasn't got the detail behind his target.
Yeah, well, having spent some time in North Queensland this week, I could tell you the Labor Party also needs to get their message right in terms of coal, because it's a very different mood in Townsville and the surrounding areas than it is in other parts of the nation when it comes to that issue. Let's look at Michael McCormack now. He said to Jeff Chambers in the Australian newspaper, "It really annoys me that I think states have been let off the hook largely this summer." So very critical of the state's performance during this summer of crisis, and that was picked up by Labor.
On the bushfires, the Deputy Prime Minister has said, and I quote, "It really annoys me that I think states have been let off the hook largely this summer," end quote. When people in bushfire-affected communities just want help, why is the government blaming Gladys Berejiklian?
Well, what I also said, Mr Speaker, was that under the federation model, the state governments take on responsibility as first responders and have performed that role in fighting the fires, and they have, and well done to them. But as far as the recovery efforts, again, the states first and foremost rely on us when they call us, but we can't do it all as a Commonwealth because that's their obligation and responsibility. And what I also said was, and this is important, we'll work with them and we'll be there for the long haul, as we will. We will be there. We've already put $2 billion on the table, as we have. We'll be there to help them through this crisis, but it will be ongoing. It will be months, if not years. That's what I said. And if you want to start talking about these things, you should say exactly what I've said, not just a bit of it.
Deputy Prime Minister there trying to mop up some of those ill-advised comments in The Australian today. Andrew Constance is the Transport Minister in New South Wales, and he spoke to my colleague Andrew Clennell a bit earlier.
Well, look, I mean, the first thing I can't help but think is, how does this help a person living under a tarp in a, with a caravan on a burnt-out block of land, which is the case right now? I've had to speak out with reason this summer. I make no apologies for it because my community was hurting and it still is. Whilst we can all get into this blame game and we might feel better about ourselves when we see our names in the newspaper, the reality is that we've got to help people, and we really do need to help people.
Andrew Constance has been one of the best leaders, I think, certainly for his community, reflected the trauma and the emotions of what they went through. He didn't want to get into the blame game today.
No, he didn't, although I guess he was saying it's time for an end to the blame game, so that was a bit of a shot at McCormack. But I do think the public are sick of these guys, state and federal, having a go at each other. We've got some really serious issues at play here. And, they're almost squabbling like children on occasion, Kieran, and it's got to stop. I mean, on the coronavirus, on the fires, they've got to be pulling in the same direction and put personal enmities or disputes over funding aside. I mean, that's what the community want to see, that's for sure. One sign of that, perhaps, was Andrew Constance talking about in that interview the prospect of him doing what Michael McCormack and the federal government want and bringing infrastructure funding forward, particularly for the Princes and Newell highways. So that sounds like some welcome news. Let's have a listen to that.
We've had the letter arrive overnight, and I'm going to do everything I can with John Barilaro to make sure we try and fast-track some stimulus in the regions because it's important, and it's the only way, in many ways, out of a lot of these challenges. It's going to have to be an infrastructure-led recovery for the bush, and there were some good dollars already on the table. Now it's a question of how we can reprofile that funding amount so that we can bring on projects more quickly, and that's what the guys have asked for us.
Just on coronavirus again, sorry, Kieran, it's been put to me that essentially it wasn't close in terms of a potential travel ban on Japan. Italy's another matter, but complicated, as we reported, by the European travel sort of situation. But Japan is a way off a travel ban at the moment. Perhaps some good news for people who still hold on to that hope that there'll be an Olympics, although that looks like a big ask at this point. Anyway, that's where we're at. But day by day, this thing's just developing, isn't it, as are the travel bans.
Andrew Clennell, as always, thanks so much for that. Appreciate it. Let's